You have spent too much of your life trying to make people understand you. Too many nights replaying conversations in your head, wondering if you said it right, wondering if they took it wrong, wondering what they must be thinking about you now. Too many mornings carrying the weight of someone else's opinion before you even had your first cup of coffee. Too many moments where you were fully present in your own life and then, without warning, someone said something, gave you a look, went silent in a way that felt loud, and suddenly you weren't living anymore. You were defending. You were explaining. You were trying, again, to justify the simple fact of being who you are. And I need to ask you something. Not to judge you. Not to make you feel small. But because this question matters more than most people realize. How long have you been doing this? Not days. Not months. How many years of your life have gone by while you were busy trying to earn the right to exist exactly as you are? Because here is what I have come to understand after a long time of watching people, of listening to people, of sitting with my own quiet failures and hard-won moments of clarity. Most people who demand explanations from you are not looking for understanding. They are looking for control. There is a difference. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Someone who genuinely wants to understand you will listen with patience. They will ask questions that come from care, not accusation. They will hold space for the possibility that your experience is different from theirs and still completely valid. But someone who demands that you explain yourself, who pressures you into justifying your choices, who makes you feel guilty for having needs, who weaponizes your silence against you, who treats your boundaries like personal attacks, that person is not asking you to explain. That person is asking you to surrender, to shrink, to fold, to become something smaller and more manageable, something that does not challenge them, something that does not remind them of the choices they never had the courage to make themselves. And the heartbreaking part? 4 years, maybe decades, you gave them exactly what they wanted. Not because you were weak, but because you were kind. Because you believed that if you tried hard enough, if you were patient enough, if you found just the right words at just the right moment, they would finally see you. They would finally say, I understand. I was wrong. You are enough. But that moment never came. Or if it came, it didn't last. And you were back to explaining again. Marcus Aurelius was one of the most powerful men who ever lived. Emperor of Rome. Commander of armies. Holder of more earthly power than most people can imagine. And yet, in the private pages of what we now call his meditations, he wrote to himself again and again about the burden of other people's opinions. Not because he was weak, but because he was honest enough to admit that the noise of what others thought about him was one of the hardest things to silence. He wrote about it with a kind of gentle severity, reminding himself that the opinions of others were not within his control, that they were not his responsibility to manage, that the only thing that belonged to him, truly and completely, was his own inner life, his own judgment, his own response to the world. And he was the Emperor of Rome. If he had to remind himself of this, what does that say about the rest of us? It says that the need for approval is not a flaw. It is not a sign of weakness or immaturity. It is one of the oldest, most deeply human needs there is. We are wired for connection. We are wired to want to belong, to be accepted, to be seen and known and valued by the people around us. There is nothing wrong with that. But there is something that goes wrong when that need becomes a prison. When you cannot make a decision without first consulting the imaginary jury in your head. When you cannot rest until you know everyone is satisfied. When you lose yourself piece by piece, year by year, trying to be acceptable to people who were never truly for you to begin with. That is the prison. And most people never even realize they are inside it. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And I think about that a lot. Because most of the explanations we prepare, most of the defenses we rehearse in the shower, most of the conversations we replay at 2 in the morning, they are not even real. They are imagined confrontations with imagined versions of people. They are arguments we are having alone, in the silence of our own minds, against opponents who may not even be thinking about us at all. We are exhausting ourselves fighting battles that exist only in our heads. We are spending real emotional energy, real time, real pieces of our inner peace, on suffering that we are creating for ourselves because we have not yet given ourselves permission to stop caring what certain people think. And that is the cruelest part of all of this. Not that others judge us. People will always judge. That is human nature, and it will never change. The cruelest part is that we do most of the damage ourselves. We take their imagined criticism and we amplify it. We turn it over and over in our minds until it becomes more real than anything they actually said. We give it power they never asked for and never deserved. And then we wonder why we feel so tired. Why we feel so small. Why, no matter how much we achieve or how hard we try or how carefully we live, there is always this low hum of anxiety just beneath the surface. That hum is the sound of a life that has been shaped too long by the wrong voices. I want you to think about something right now. Think about the last time you made a decision that was truly right for you. Not for your family. Not for your friends. Not for the version of yourself you perform for the world. A decision that came from somewhere deep and quiet inside you. Something you knew. Something that aligned with who you actually are beneath all the roles you play and all the expectations you carry. Now think about what happened next. How long did it take before you started second-guessing it? Before you started wondering what others would think? Before you felt the pull to explain, to justify, to soften it so it would be more acceptable to someone else? For most people, that pull comes almost immediately. Before the decision is even fully made, the explanation is already being prepared. And that is how we lose ourselves. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small surrenders, each one so quiet, so reasonable, so wrapped in kindness and consideration, that we barely notice them happening. Until one day we look up and realize we have been living a version of our life that was edited for other people's comfort. If this reflection is landing somewhere deep inside you right now, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and leave a like before you continue. Not because it matters to an algorithm, but because when you do that, you help this message reach someone else who is sitting exactly where you are right now, tired and quiet, wondering if it is finally okay to stop explaining themselves to people who were never truly listening. One simple gesture, and someone else gets to feel less alone today. Epictetus did not come from privilege. He was born a slave. He lived in physical pain for most of his life. He owned almost nothing. And yet he became one of the clearest thinkers the ancient world ever produced. Because he understood earlier and more deeply than most, that there are two categories of things in this life. Things within your control, and things outside your control. Your thoughts, your responses, your values, your choices, those belong to you. Everything else, other people's opinions, their reactions, their judgments, their moods, those do not belong to you. They never did. They never will. And the moment you stop treating them as your responsibility, something extraordinary happens. Not overnight. Not all at once. But slowly, quietly, unmistakably, you get lighter. The weight you have been carrying, the weight of being responsible for how everyone else sees you, the weight of managing perceptions and softening truths and bending yourself into shapes that were never yours, that weight begins to lift. And underneath it, you find something you may not have felt in a very long time. Yourself. Still there. Still whole. Waiting. There is a kind of loneliness that no one talks about enough. It is not the loneliness of being alone in a room. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling invisible. Still feeling like the version of you that shows up every day is not really you at all, but a careful, edited, pre-approved version of you. One that has been softened and adjusted and trimmed down over the years to fit into spaces that were never built for who you truly are. And what makes this loneliness so heavy is that most people never trace it back to its real source. They think they are lonely because they need more connection, more conversation, more presence from the people around them. But the truth is often the opposite. The loneliness comes not from a lack of others, but from a lack of yourself. From years of showing up as a version of you that was designed to be acceptable rather than authentic. From years of swallowing the things you really felt, the opinions you really held, the needs you really had, because somewhere along the way you learned that those things made people uncomfortable. That they caused friction. That it was easier, safer, less painful to just smooth it all over and keep the peace. And keeping the peace became your full-time job. A job no one hired you for, no one thanked you for, and no one even noticed you were doing. Until you were so far from yourself that you couldn't quite remember what it felt like to simply say what you meant and let it stand without apology. Marcus Aurelius understood this erosion. He understood how slowly and quietly a person can lose their own center when they spend too much energy looking outward, measuring themselves against the reactions of others, adjusting their inner life to match the expectations of the world around them. He wrote about the importance of returning, not escaping, not retreating into isolation or bitterness, but returning, deliberately and gently, to your own inner life, to the values you actually hold, to the person you actually are beneath all the noise. He called it retreating into yourself, and he said there was no more peaceful or untroubled retreat than the one a man finds within his own soul. Not a place you go to hide, a place you go to remember. And when you remember who you are, something changes. Not all at once, but in a way that is real and lasting. You stop needing the explanation to land perfectly. You stop needing the other person to agree. You stop measuring the value of your choices by whether or not someone else approved of them. Because you have found something more stable than approval. You have found your own ground again. And I want to speak honestly about something here, because it needs to be said. There are people in your life, maybe people you love deeply, who have benefited from your silence. Who have grown comfortable with the version of you that never pushes back, never says this is not right for me, never draws a line and holds it. They may not have done this consciously. Most people don't. But over time, a pattern was established. You yielded, and they advanced. You explained, and they critiqued. You apologized, and they accepted the apology as confirmation that they were right. And the longer that pattern went on, the more invisible your real self became, even to yourself. Seneca wrote that it is not that I am brave enough to tell the truth. It is that I am tired enough to stop telling lies. And that tiredness, that deep bone-level exhaustion you feel when you think about continuing to perform and justify and manage other people's feelings at the expense of your own, that is not a crisis. That is clarity arriving. That is your inner life sending you a message it has probably been trying to send you for a very long time. And the message is simple. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to stop performing. You are allowed to stop justifying. You are allowed to stop waiting for a permission that was never anyone else's to give you. I want to pause here for a moment and invite you to do something. If somewhere in this reflection you have recognized yourself, if you have felt that quiet ache of someone who has spent too long making themselves small for others, I want you to write one word in the comments. Just one word that describes what you are feeling right now. It does not have to be explained. It does not have to make sense to anyone else. Just one word, honest and yours. Because there is something powerful about naming what we feel, even in a single word. It is a small act of reclaiming your voice. And this channel exists precisely for moments like this one, for people who are ready to stop living on the edges of their own lives and return to the center of who they are. If that is you, subscribe, leave a like, and know that you are not alone in this. Epictetus said that the first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself. Not others. Not circumstances. Yourself. And what I have come to understand is that conquering yourself does not mean controlling yourself in the way we usually think of control. It does not mean suppressing your emotions or hardening yourself against feeling. It means something quieter and far more profound. It means refusing to be ruled by the need for external validation. It means building your sense of self on something more solid than other people's opinions, which shift like weather, which change without warning, which have more to do with the other person's inner life than they ever had to do with yours. When you conquer yourself in this way, You stop being held hostage by the question of what they will think. You stop rehearsing explanations for decisions that were sound. You stop shrinking in rooms where you should be standing fully. Not with arrogance. Not with indifference. But with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who knows who they are and has decided that that is enough. Not because the world confirmed it, but because you did. Also, I left something in the comments for those who want to go deeper into this reflection. A small book that touches exactly this pain we are sitting with today, the pain of living too long for other people's approval, of losing yourself piece by piece in the effort to be accepted. It is gentle and unhurried, written for people who are ready to return to themselves. If you feel called to it, it will be there waiting for you. There is also something important I want to say about the people who will not understand this. And there will be some. When you begin to change, when you stop over-explaining and start simply living, when you stop apologizing for your needs and start honoring them, not everyone will celebrate that. Some people will be confused. Some will be hurt. Some will call it coldness, or selfishness, or pride. And that will be painful, especially if those people are ones you love. But here is what Marcus Aurelius would remind you of in that moment. You are not responsible for how your growth lands in someone else's insecurity. You are not required to stay small so that others feel comfortable. The discomfort they feel when you begin to live more honestly is not your wound to heal. It is theirs to sit with, to examine, to grow from, if they choose. Your only responsibility is to continue. To keep walking back toward yourself with patience and without apology. Because a life lived fully in your own truth, even if it is misunderstood by some, is worth infinitely more than a life lived in perfect comfort at the cost of who you are. At some point in life, usually after enough loss, enough disappointment, enough quiet suffering carried alone, a person arrives at a question that changes everything. Not a dramatic question. Not one that announces itself with thunder or urgency. It arrives softly, almost like a whisper in the middle of an ordinary day. And the question is this. Who would I be if I stopped caring what they think? Not who would I perform. Not who would I pretend to be. But who would I actually be, in the privacy of my own choices, in the fullness of my own life, if the imaginary jury in my head finally went silent and I was left alone with nothing but my own values and my own sense of what is true and good and worth living for? Most people never let themselves sit with that question long enough to hear the answer. Because the answer is terrifying and liberating in equal measure. It is terrifying because it asks you to take full responsibility for your own life, with no one else to blame and no one else's approval to hide behind. And it is liberating because it reveals that the person you have been trying so hard to make acceptable to others is actually already whole. Already enough. Already worthy of a life lived on their own terms. Seneca wrote that a person is not poor who has little, but one who craves more. And I think that wisdom reaches far beyond money or possessions. I think it reaches into the deepest places of the human heart. Because the person who craves approval, who cannot rest until they are understood and validated and confirmed by others, that person lives in a kind of poverty that has nothing to do with what they own. They are rich in effort and poor in peace. They are generous with their explanations and bankrupt in their sense of self. And no amount of external recognition ever fills that emptiness, because the emptiness was not created by a lack of appreciation from others. It was created by a lack of presence with yourself. By years of outsourcing your sense of worth to people and opinions and reactions that were never stable enough to hold it. The Stoics understood this with a clarity that still cuts through centuries. They understood that the only foundation worth building a life on is an internal one. Not rigid, not cold, not isolated from others, but grounded, rooted in something that does not move when the wind changes, something that does not collapse when someone misunderstands you or withdraws their approval or decides, for reasons that have everything to do with them and nothing to do with you, that you are not what they needed you to be. And here I want to speak to the grief of this. Because there is real grief in letting go of the need to be understood. There is grief in accepting that some people, no matter how much you love them, no matter how patiently you explain yourself, no matter how carefully you choose your words, will simply not be capable of seeing you clearly. Not because you failed. Not because you were not clear enough, or kind enough, or patient enough. But because seeing you clearly would require them to examine things in themselves that they are not ready to examine. And that is their journey, not yours. But the grief is real. The longing to be truly known by the people you love most, that is one of the most human things there is. And it deserves to be honored, not dismissed. You are allowed to grieve the understanding you never received. You are allowed to mourn the conversations that never went the way you needed them to go, the moments of recognition that never came, the relationships that asked you to be smaller than you were and called it love. You are allowed to feel all of that. Feeling it fully is not weakness. It is the beginning of release. Because you cannot let go of what you have never fully held. And until you allow yourself to name the pain clearly and honestly, it will keep living inside you as a quiet, unnamed weight that shapes your choices without your awareness. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, again and again, as if reminding himself of something he knew but kept forgetting, that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. And what stands in the way of your peace right now may be precisely this. The belief that you cannot rest until you are understood. The belief that your life cannot fully begin until the people who matter have confirmed that you are allowed to live it. That belief is the obstacle. And the Stoic insight is that the obstacle itself is the path. The very act of choosing to move forward without that confirmation, of choosing to live fully and honestly even in the absence of approval, that is not a compromise. That is the practice. That is where the real transformation happens. Not in some future moment when everyone finally understands you. But right now, in this moment, in the quiet decision to trust yourself more than you trust the noise. I want to say something to those of you who are older in years and still carrying this weight. Because I think it deserves to be said directly. You have already given so much of your life to managing other people's perceptions of you. You have already spent years being careful and accommodating and considerate in ways that cost you more than anyone knows. And you deserve, in whatever time remains ahead of you, to live differently. Not perfectly. Not without care for others. Not without love or connection or community. But without the constant, exhausting performance of justification. Without the need to earn your place in every room you enter. Without the low hum of anxiety that comes from measuring your worth by how well you are currently being received. You have earned the right to simply be. Not because you finally figured everything out. Not because you have become someone extraordinary. But because you are here. Because you have lived and loved and suffered and endured. And because no one, not one single person on this earth, has the authority to tell you that the life you have lived, the person you have become through all of it, requires their approval before it counts. Epictetus, who had every reason to be bitter and broken, who lived in chains and in pain and in conditions that would have destroyed most people, arrived at a freedom that his captors could never take from him. Not because he escaped his circumstances, but because he understood, deeply and completely, that his inner life belonged only to him. That no external force, no opinion, no judgment, no cruelty could touch the place inside him where his true self lived. And that is the inheritance the Stoics left us. Not a philosophy of cold detachment. Not a manual for suppressing emotion or hardening the heart. But a path back to yourself. A quiet, dignified, deeply human path back to the person who was always there beneath the noise. The person who never actually needed the explanation to be accepted. Who never actually needed the approval to be whole. Who was always, even in the most uncertain and painful moments, already enough. If something in this reflection has stayed with you, if some part of what was said today landed in a place inside you that recognizes it as true, I want you to know that you do not have to rush past that feeling. Let it stay. Let it settle. Let it ask its quiet questions. And if you feel ready to go deeper, to continue this reflection beyond these words, I left something in the comments for you. A small book that speaks gently and honestly about this very journey, about the long, tender, necessary work of returning to yourself after years of living for others. It is there whenever you are ready, with no hurry and no pressure. Just an open door for those who feel they want to walk through it. And to everyone who has listened this far, who sat with this reflection through all its difficult and honest moments, I want to leave you with this. The most radical thing you can do in a world that constantly demands your explanation, your justification, your performance, your proof of worthiness, is simply to stop. Not in bitterness. Not in anger. Not by turning away from people or from life. But by returning, gently and without apology, to the only authority that was ever truly yours. Your own inner life. Your own sense of what is true. Your own quiet knowledge of who you are and what you value and how you want to live the days that remain ahead of you. Marcus Aurelius spent his life reminding himself of this. Seneca wrote letters about it until the end of his days. Epictetus taught it from a place of suffering that most of us will never know. They did not arrive at this wisdom because life was easy. They arrived at it because they chose, over and over again, to return to themselves instead of surrendering to the noise. And so can you. Not someday. Not when things are calmer or clearer, or when the people around you finally come around. Now. In this moment. In this quiet space between one breath and the next, where nothing is required of you and nothing needs to be explained, and the only voice that matters is the one that has always known exactly who you are. You never owed anyone an explanation for that.